It was supposed to be a peaceful solo retreat, a break from the concrete cage of city life, a weekend spent alone in nature at a remote cabin I rented through a lesser-known app that catered to off-grid experiences. The listing promised serenity, a wood-burning stove, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and nothing but forest in every direction. Exactly what I thought I needed. The drive to Birch Hollow took me 5 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows through the dense pines. But I found the cabin exactly where it was described. Simple, weathered, and sitting quietly, in a clearing choked by overgrown brush and moss-covered stone. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a certain rustic charm, until the first night, when I noticed the footprints around the back window. They weren't mine. They were barefoot, adult-sized, and pressed deep into the damp earth, as though someone had been standing there for a while. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, or maybe leftover from the last renter, but something about the spacing of the steps and how they circled the cabin unsettled me. That night, I lay awake, the silence thick as wool, until I heard it. A dragging sound across the porch. Then a knock, not sharp or urgent, but slow and deliberate, like someone testing whether I was really alone. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just lay there with my eyes wide open in the darkness, until the sound finally stopped an hour later. The next morning, I found a small pile of bones, arranged in a spiral on the porch. Bird bones, mostly, picked clean and placed with disturbing precision. I wanted to leave, but my car battery was dead. No explanation, no warning, just gone. I tried my satellite phone, but it wouldn't connect, so I hiked to the edge of the woods to find reception, and that's when I saw him. A man, filthy, bearded and skeletal thin, standing perfectly still just beyond the trees. He didn't run, didn't move, just stared at me with pale, sunken eyes that didn't blink. I turned and ran back to the cabin, locked myself inside and waited. That night he returned, circling the cabin, whispering something low and wet like a chant. In the early dawn hours, I saw him sitting in a tree, watching me through the upstairs window, grinning with a mouth too wide and too many teeth. I barricaded. The doors lit every candle I had, and waited until the second day passed in an unbearable silence. On the third morning, a ranger finally arrived, responding to an old emergency beacon that had gone off on its own from the cabin. Something I never activated. He found me curled up under the bed, shaking and incoherent. When I told him about the man, he went pale and said only, "You're not the first." As we left, I looked back at the tree line, and I swear I saw that grin again, just before it vanished behind the bark like smoke. Backpacking solo through the Pacific Northwest had been a dream of mine for years, and when I finally took a sabbatical from work, I planned every detail meticulously: routes, resupply points, check-ins with friends. But on day 6, while hiking, along the Timberline Trail, I made the mistake of veering off the marked path to explore an older, less maintained section that wasn't on any of my maps, tempted by a hand-carved wooden sign that simply read, Peacewater Trail. It was narrow, steep, and lined with ancient trees so thick their canopy darkened the forest like twilight even at midday. I figured I'd loop back after a couple hours, but by the time I realized I was turned around, it was already getting late, and a cold mist had rolled in from nowhere. I set up camp on a dry patch near a dead creek bed and tried to reassure myself with warm food and tea, but the moment dusk hit, everything changed. The forest went too quiet. No insects, no birds, just a flat, oppressive silence. Then the echoing started. I would hear my own movements, steps, zippers, even breath, but repeated back at me moments later, faint and distant, like someone was mimicking me from behind a tree. I called out, "Is someone there?" and heard my own voice answer seconds later, "Is someone there?" but warped like it came through a broken speaker and definitely not in my tone. I barely slept, and around 3 a.m. I heard leaves crunching in a circle around my tent, faster and faster like someone was sprinting. Then it stopped. Then came a whisper right beside the nylon, "You shouldn't have left the trail." I bolted. Out, flashlight shaking, and found nothing. No prints, no movement, just trees that suddenly looked older, thicker, wrong. I hiked all day in one direction using my compass, but ended up right back at the same creek bed by sundown. I burned extra firewood, stayed up with my knife in hand and waited. The next night I saw her. She stepped from behind a tree in the fog, an impossibly tall woman in tattered 19th century clothes, eyes completely black, mouth moving silently. She mimicked my steps, my gestures, even when I froze. I screamed at her to stop, and she screamed, back with my voice louder than anything human. I threw my pack and ran. I don't know how, but I eventually stumbled into a ranger station miles away, exhausted, bloody, and dehydrated. They said the Peace Water Trail hasn't existed for decades. No one had maintained or marked it in over 70 years. When I showed them where I'd camped, one old ranger pulled me aside and whispered, "There's something in that part of the forest that doesn't let people go. You're lucky it got bored of you." I never went back. I was deep in the Appalachians, volunteering with a reforestation non-profit, spending 3 weeks living out of tents and planting saplings in some of the most remote patches of forest I'd ever seen, places without roads, without names, where the trees grew too close and the light barely reached the forest floor. One day we split up into small teams to cover more ground, but due to a miscommunication, I ended up alone near dusk, far from base camp and with a busted radio. I decided to make camp rather than risk getting more lost, and while it wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the woods, something about this particular place felt wrong. The air had a sour smell, the trees were gnarled and unnatural, and I found strange symbols carved into the trunks, circles with slashes, spirals, and eye shapes, all too uniform to be random. That night I woke to a sound like whimpering, a child's voice, faint and trembling, calling from the trees. "Hello? Help me. I'm lost." My blood ran cold. I knew that voice didn't belong out there. I stayed quiet, heart pounding, and it repeated, "Hello," again and again, always the same intonation, like a recording. I didn't sleep. By morning I packed up and tried to hike back, but my trail markers were gone, replaced by more of those symbols, freshly carved. Then I started seeing things, blurred shapes darting between trees, tall figures watching from just out of sight. One stepped into view that night, impossibly thin, dressed in patchwork clothing and wearing a face that looked stretched, like a mask made of wet cloth. It didn't move. It just stared. I ran, not knowing where, just away, and found myself in a clearing littered with bones, some of them animal, some disturbingly human-shaped. The trees around the clearing had hollow knots, and from each came soft whispers like wind. Only they weren't in English or any language I recognized. I backed away, turned, and came face to face with another one. Its mouth hung open too wide, like it had been sliced, and it whispered directly into my face. "You've seen too much." I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying on a ranger's cot days later, dehydrated, and found wandering near a service road. No one could explain how I got there or what had happened. But I knew. The hollow ones had let me go, maybe as a warning. Maybe for fun. But I left something behind in those woods. I don't know what, but sometimes when I'm alone at night I feel like it's still missing.